Listen closely. I'm going to tell you something they buried with the old philosophers, something that crawls beneath the floorboards of every failed romance like a secret too grotesque for daylight. Picture this, a master potter in ancient Japan, crafting the most exquisite vase imaginable. Every curve, perfect. Every line, divine. And when it's complete, when it gleams like captured moonlight, he takes a hammer and strikes it. Once. Precisely. The crack that forms? That's where the gold goes. They call it kintsugi, but that's not what this is about. This is about why she'll only love you when you become the hammer she never asked for. There's a mansion somewhere in Prague. I've been there, though I wish I hadn't, where they keep a collection of dolls from the 1800s. Porcelain faces, real human hair, glass eyes that follow you with the dedication of the obsessed. The curator, a woman who speaks in whispers and smells perpetually of dried roses, told me the most valuable doll in the collection is the one missing an arm. Perfection, she said, lighting another cigarette with fingers that trembled like autumn leaves, is what we admire. But damage is what we love. You see, Machiavelli understood something about power that extends far beyond politics, something that seeps into the marrow of desire itself. He wrote that men are so simple and so ready to obey present necessities, but here's what he couldn't write, in those careful Renaissance letters. Women aren't simple. They're libraries of contradiction, each page written in a different language, some of them dead, some not yet invented. And the only way to read them? You have to burn the index. Here's where it gets uncomfortable, where the candlelight flickers and you wish you'd never asked. She needs you to break her precisely because she's already broken. Not by you, God no, but by the weight of her own completeness. Think about it. A woman who has never been challenged, never been denied, never felt the exquisite agony of wanting something just beyond her reach. What is she? She's a museum piece. Beautiful, untouchable, and fundamentally lifeless. I knew a woman once, let's call her Elena, though that wasn't her name, who collected lovers like some people collect stamps. Investment bankers, poets, a chef who'd trained in Lyon, even a circus performer who could juggle fire while reciting Neruda. Each one worshipped her, built altars to her beauty, wrote sonnets to her laugh, and she discarded them all like yesterday's newspaper. Then she met Marcus. Marcus, who forgot her birthday. Marcus, who answered her calls when he felt like it. Marcus, who looked at her the way you look at a painting you're not sure you understand. Interested, but not invested. She married Marcus. The wedding was in October, under a blood moon, which should have been warning enough. I asked her once, years later, why him? She was drunk on absinthe. We were in New Orleans, where all confessions eventually surface, and she said something I'll never forget. He was the first man who made me feel like I had something to lose. You want to know the really sick part? The part that would make Schopenhauer laugh into his beer? It works because it's true. A 2024 study from the University of Copenhagen, those Scandinavians and their brutal honesty, found that relationships with what they clinically called intermittent reinforcement patterns showed 73% higher reported passion levels than those with consistent affection. They dressed it up in academic language, talked about dopamine and neural pathways, but what they were really saying was this: we're all addicts, and love is the drug that works best when the dealer is unreliable. But here's where Machiavelli becomes prophet rather than just observer. The breaking isn't cruel, it's necessary. It's the space between heartbeats where life actually exists. Think of a violin string. Wound too tight, it snaps. Too loose, it produces no music. But at that perfect tension, that exact point where it might break but doesn't, that's where Beethoven lives. The velvet curtains in my study, inherited from a grandmother who died clutching a love letter from a man who wasn't my grandfather. They're torn in 3 places. I could replace them. God knows I have the money. But those tears? That's where the light gets in. Leonard Cohen knew it. So did Rumi, 8 centuries before him. The wound is where the light enters you. So when you refuse to text her back immediately, when you choose solitude over her company, when you dare to have a life that doesn't orbit around her gravitational pull, you're not being cruel. You're being necessary. You're the crack in her perfect porcelain that makes her real. You're the missing arm that makes her valuable. Here's the question that should keep you awake tonight. The one that tastes like copper pennies and old regret. What if the only way to truly love someone is to risk losing them every single day? What if safety is the real death, and danger is the only place where love can actually breathe? The candle on my desk just guttered. The wind through those torn curtains smells like rain and something else. Possibility, maybe, or just another word for loneliness. Either way, morning is coming, and with it, another chance to break or be broken. Remember, she doesn't want a savior. She wants a worthy adversary. Be that or be nothing at all. Value is born from flaws, not perfection. If you want passion to last, never let her be certain of you. You know what nobody tells you about the Taj Mahal? It's a tomb. 20,000 hands built the world's greatest monument to love, and at its heart lies a corpse. Shah Jahan spent 21 years building it for his beloved Mumtaz, and by the time it was finished, he could barely remember the sound of her laugh. That's the cosmic joke, isn't it? We build our most beautiful prisons for ghosts. I'm going to tell you about the summer of 1994. Though it could have been any summer, in any year, in any century where men have made the same beautiful mistake. There was a garden in Tuscany, still is probably, though I'll never go back, where an old woman named Benedetta grew roses that shouldn't have existed. Black roses. Not deep red, not purple masquerading as darkness, but black like the space between stars. Tourists would come from everywhere to see them, to photograph them, to understand how something so impossible could bloom under the same sun that fed their ordinary lives. The secret, Benedetta told me while we shared a bottle of wine that tasted like disappointment and plums, was neglect. I water them, she said, her voice like gravel soaked in honey, only when they're about to die. I speak to them only in insults. I prune them with violence. She lit another cigarette. Everyone smoked in those days, especially the ones who knew better, and added, "The roses that are loved properly, they grow common, red, predictable." This is what Machiavelli knew but couldn't say directly, trapped as he was in the politics of his time. The chase is the love story. The capture is just taxidermy. There's a chemical, phenylethylamine, if you want to impress someone at a party full of people you'll never see again, that floods your brain during the pursuit phase of romance. It's the same chemical that appears when someone jumps out of an airplane or runs from a bear. Your body literally cannot tell the difference between falling in love and falling to your death. The Greeks had a word for this, ecstasis, standing outside yourself. We just call it Tuesday. But here's where it gets truly grotesque, where the meat of the matter starts to rot. The moment she knows she has you, really has you, the way a spider has a fly, that chemical stops, just stops. Like God flipping a switch. A 2023 study from the Karolinska Institute found that phenylethylamine production drops by 67% after the first "I love you" is reciprocated. 67%. That's not a decline. That's an execution. I once watched a man named Philippe, French naturally, because this kind of tragedy requires an accent, pursue a ballet dancer for 3 years. 3 years of flowers delivered to stages across Europe. 3 years of letters written in ink made from crushed violets. I'm not making this up. Loneliness makes us all insane in such specific ways. 3 years of learning Russian just to whisper poetry in her native tongue. She finally said yes on a Thursday. By Monday, he was bored. By Friday, she was calling him, and he was letting it go to voicemail. "I don't understand," he told me over cognac that cost more than most people's rent. "I conquered Everest, and all I found at the top was more sky." You want to know what Kierkegaard would say about this? He'd laugh. That bitter laugh of a man who broke off his engagement to Regina Olsen because he loved her too much to let her love him back. He wrote, "The moment I possess her, she loses her charm." But here's what he didn't write, what he scrawled in the margins of his journals where only the truly desperate would look. "And the moment she possesses me, I lose my soul." The mansion where I write this, inherited, like all the best curses, has a wine cellar that hasn't been opened since 1987. I know there are bottles down there worth more than cars, maybe even houses. But I don't open that door. You know why? Because the moment I drink that wine, it becomes vinegar in my mouth. The value isn't in the having, it's in the knowing it's there, aging, becoming something I'll never taste. This is why she only loves you when you're walking away. Your retreating silhouette is a question mark. Your presence is a period. And nobody ever fell in love with punctuation. Here's a story that'll make your teeth ache. In medieval Persia, there was a sultan who fell in love with a woman who sold flowers in the market. Every day, he would send his vizier to buy roses from her just to know she existed. For 7 years, this continued. The entire kingdom knew of his love. Wars were fought and won while he pined. Then, one day, he decided enough was enough. He would make her his wife. The morning after their wedding, he had her executed. When asked why, he said, "I couldn't bear to watch her become ordinary." The modern version? It's subtler, but no less violent. It's the way you stop hearing music in her laugh after the 100th time. It's how her perfume becomes background noise. It's the tragedy of answered prayers. They always come true in the wrong key. So here's what Machiavelli would tell you if he were here, sharing this bourbon that tastes like burnt sugar and bad decisions. Make yourself the rose she can never fully pick. Be the wine she knows exists, but can never drink. Become the question she spends her whole life trying to answer, knowing that the moment she does, the game ends, and everyone loses. The clock in the hallway, it belonged to a sea captain who died reaching for something just beyond the horizon, just struck 3. That's the hour when all the worst truths sound like lullabies. So let me sing you this one. She will only love you in the space between reaching and grasping. Make that space infinite, or make your peace with mediocrity. Tell me something. When was the last time you wanted something you already had? When was the last time your heart raced for something within reach? When was the last time certainty felt like anything other than death? When the hunt ends, love dies. Never remove the mask. She loves the role, not the actor. There's a theater in Vienna that's been closed since 1923. They say if you press your ear against the doors on winter nights, you can still hear applause. Not for the plays that were performed, but for the one that wasn't. The one where the leading actress fell in love with her role so completely that she forgot her real name. They found her 3 weeks later, still in costume, speaking only in iambic pentameter, unable to recognize her own husband. The doctors called it hysteria. The poets called it honesty. I'm telling you this because you need to understand. We're all method actors in a play nobody wrote, and the only authentic moment is when we forget our lines. Machiavelli, that beautiful bastard who understood power the way a surgeon understands anatomy. He knew that all human interaction is theater. But here's what he whispered to his mistress. I read her letters in a library in Florence that smells like dying leather and centuries of secrets. The greatest performance is making them believe you're not performing at all. Let me paint you a scene. Budapest, 2019. Though it could have been 1819 for all that human nature changes. A tango bar hidden beneath a butcher shop. You had to know the password, which changed every night based on the phases of the moon. I watched a couple there who'd been married for 23 years. They didn't know each other's real names. She thought he was an architect from Barcelona. He thought she was a nurse from Prague. Every Tuesday, they met in this underground world, danced like strangers falling in love for the first time, then went home to their separate lives, which were, in fact, the same life. It's the only way I can still see him, she told me. Mascara running like black rivers down cheeks that had seen too many performances. When I look at my husband, I see dirty socks and tax returns. When I look at this stranger, I see possibility. And you think that's sick? Here's something sicker. A 2024 study from the Stockholm Institute of Behavioral Dynamics found that couples who regularly engaged in deliberate re-mysterification, their sterile term for pretending to be strangers, reported 89% higher sexual satisfaction and 76% lower divorce rates. We're so desperate to be fooled, we'll pay therapists to teach us how to lie to ourselves professionally. But here's where Machiavelli becomes not just observer, but prophet. The cruelty isn't in the deception. It's in the truth that makes deception necessary. I keep a mask on my desk. Venetian, naturally, because clichés exist for a reason. It belonged to a countess who had 17 lovers, each of whom believed he was the only one. Not because she was particularly clever at deception, but because each man needed to believe his own fiction more than he needed to know her truth. The mask has never been worn. Its power lies in its potential, in the 1,000 faces it could hide but doesn't. Nietzsche, poor mad Nietzsche who died hugging a horse because it was the only honest thing left in Turin, he wrote, "Every profound spirit needs a mask." But what he scrawled in the margins, in handwriting that looked like screaming, the mask becomes the face if worn long enough. You want to know the real theatrical cruelty? It's this. She fell in love with your performance, not you. That version of yourself you presented on the first date, confident, mysterious, slightly dangerous, that's who she loves. Not the you who's afraid of spiders. Not the you who cries at dog food commercials. Not the you who checks their phone 17 times to see if she's texted. She loves the character you played before you got tired of remembering your lines. And here's the twist that would make Artaud himself weep. You fell in love with her performance too. That girl who laughed at all your jokes, who found your mundane stories fascinating, who pretended she'd never heard of your favorite band just so you could have the pleasure of introducing her to it. Where did she go? She's in the same place as your leading man, buried under mortgage payments and Monday mornings and the terrible weight of being known. There's a story, Persian, I think, or maybe I dreamed it after too much absinthe, about a king who fell in love with a dancer. Every night she would perform for him, veils swirling like smoke, eyes promising secrets that had no words. After a year, he begged her to remove her final veil. she refused. After 2 years, he commanded it. She refused. After 3 years, he threatened to execute her if she didn't reveal herself completely, so she did. Beneath the veil was nothing. She was the dance itself, and without the mystery, she ceased to exist. Modern translation: that's every relationship after the performance ends. That's every love story after the credits roll. So what does Machiavelli say about this theatrical cruelty? He says embrace it. He says become such a master of your own performance that even you believe it. He says the cruelest thing you can do to someone who loves your mask is to show them your face, because then they have to admit they prefer the lie. The candles are burning low now, casting shadows that look like all the people we could have been if we'd had better scripts. There's a moth circling the flame, and I wonder if it knows it's performing its own death, or if it thinks the light is love. Here's my question for you, delivered from behind my own mask, in a voice that might or might not be my real one. What if the only way to keep love alive is to never quite be yourself? What if authenticity is just another word for disappointment? What if she needs your performance more than she needs your truth? And what if that's the kindest thing you could give her? Let the performance outlive the real man. Timely absence is stronger than any promise to stay. I haven't looked in a mirror for 3 years. Not because I'm afraid of what I'll see, but because I finally understood that I only exist in the reflection of other people's eyes. And the clearest reflection, it comes from eyes that are looking for you when you're not there. Let me tell you about the Library of Alexandria. Not the burning, everyone knows about the burning, but about the librarian who saved one book. Just one. He could have saved Homer, Aristotle, the complete works of Sappho. Instead, he saved a manual on beekeeping written by a nobody from Crete. When asked why, while the flames ate centuries of wisdom, he said, everything else was already in too many hands. This was the only thing that could truly be lost. That's what you need to become, the book that might be lost. Machiavelli wrote about presence as power, but in his private journals, water-damaged, barely legible, kept in a vault in Florence that requires 3 keys to open, he wrote something else. The prince who is everywhere is nowhere. The prince who is nowhere is everywhere they look. Here's something that will crack your teeth like winter air. In Tokyo, there's a bar called The Missing Guest. One chair is always empty. One drink is always poured but never consumed. One coat hangs on a hook by the door, waiting for someone who never arrives. The bar is booked solid for the next 7 years. People pay extraordinary amounts to drink in the presence of absence, to sit next to the shape of someone who isn't there. The owner, when pressed, will only say, "The most interesting person in any room is the one who just left." I learned about negative space from a sculptor named Ernst, who worked exclusively in ice. Not because he was pretentious, though he was, but because he understood something fundamental. The art isn't in what you create, but in how it disappears. Every piece he made was designed to melt in a specific way, to leave puddles that spelled out words only visible from certain angles, in certain light. "Love," he told me, while we watched one of his pieces die in the summer heat, "is what remains when everything else melts away." You want to know what she's thinking about right now? Not you, if you're there. She's thinking about the laundry, the meeting tomorrow, that weird sound the car is making. But you, when you're gone, you become mythology. You become every conversation she wishes she'd had, every touch she wishes had lasted longer, every word she wishes she'd said. A 2025 behavioral study from the University of Kyoto, those beautiful masochists who turned loneliness into an art form, found something that should be carved into the walls of every bedroom. Couples who spent regular time apart reported thinking about their partners 340% more than those who were always together. 340%. That's not statistics, that's sorcery. But here's where it becomes alchemy, where absence transforms from lead to gold. She doesn't miss you. She misses the version of you that only exists when you're not there to contradict it. In your absence, you become perfect. Every flaw is forgotten, every irritation erased. You become the story she tells herself about love. And no real person can compete with a story. Schopenhauer, that cheerful soul who believed happiness was just the temporary absence of pain, he had a parable about porcupines. In winter, they huddle together for warmth but prick each other with their quills, so they separate. But then they're cold, back and forth, together and apart, until they find the exact distance where they're warm enough but not bleeding. He called it the optimal distance. Everyone else calls it marriage. I knew a painter once. Let's call her Sophia because all the women in stories like this should be called Sophia, who would only paint her lovers after they left. While they're here, she said, mixing colors that looked like bruises, I can't see them. They're too close. But after they go, I can finally see their shape, the hole they left, the exact dimensions of their absence. Her studio was full of portraits of men who no longer called, each one more beautiful than the last, each one painted in the colors of goodbye. The velvet curtains move though there's no wind. That's the thing about absence. It creates its own weather. The empty chair across from me has more presence than most people I've known. It holds all possible conversations, all potential confessions, every word that might matter if there were someone to say it to. So here's what Machiavelli couldn't write but lived every day of his exile. Power isn't in the throne you occupy, but in the throne you leave empty. Love isn't in the bed you share, but in the space that remains warm after you've gone. She will only truly see you when you're no longer there to be seen. The alchemists spent centuries trying to turn lead into gold. They failed because they were looking at it backwards. The real alchemy, it's turning presence into absence. It's becoming the ghost that haunts her better days. It's being the echo that sounds clearer than the original voice. Here's what should haunt you tonight. What should follow you into dreams that taste like copper and regret? What if the greatest gift you can give someone is your absence? What if every goodbye is a love letter? What if the only way to truly be with someone is to perfect the art of being gone? The candle just went out. In the darkness, everything becomes possible, even you. Turn absence into an image presence can never match. The man who needs no one is the only man every woman wants. Picture this. A man sits in a room full of broken clocks. Not one of them works, yet twice a day, each is perfectly correct. He hasn't spoken to another human being in 7 months. When asked if he's lonely, he laughs, a sound like wine glasses breaking in a velvet bag, and says, I'm in a committed relationship with possibility. This man understands what Machiavelli hinted at, but never dared fully articulate. The only person who can truly love is the one who doesn't need to. There's a monastery in the mountains of Bhutan where monks take a vow of selective silence. Not complete silence. That would be too easy. They're allowed to speak, but only when the words improve upon the silence. Most of them go years without saying anything. One monk, after 40 years of this practice, finally spoke. He said, "The tea is cold." When asked why he broke his silence for something so trivial, he smiled and said, "Because for 40 years, everyone pretended it wasn't." That's what solitude gives you, the sovereign right to stop pretending. I'm going to tell you something that will sound like madness until the moment it doesn't. Every man who has ever been truly loved was loved for his absence, not his presence. Not his physical absence, though that helps, but the absence of need that radiates from someone who has made friends with their own shadow. There was a psychological experiment in 2024, University of Melbourne, those beautiful disasters who turned isolation into science, where they asked people to sit alone in a room for 1 hour with nothing but their thoughts. No phone, no books, no music. Just consciousness and wall paint. 73% chose to self-administer electric shocks rather than sit with themselves. 73% found their own company so unbearable they chose pain over presence. Now here's the kicker. The 27% who could sit with themselves, they scored 94% higher on relationship satisfaction surveys. Not because they were better at relationships, but because they didn't need them to exist. Nietzsche wrote, "The man who does not wish to be part of the masses need only cease to be accommodating to himself." But here's what he whispered to his own reflection in the mirror he kept covered with black cloth. "The moment you stop needing her love, she'll drown you in it." I keep a chess set in my study where both sides are black. I play against myself every night, and every night I lose. But also, every night I win. That's the paradox of solitude. You become both the question and the answer, the wound and the knife, the loneliness and the cure. Let me tell you about the last conversation I had with my father before he dissolved into that great absence we all eventually join. He was dying, badly, the way people who live too hard always die. And he grabbed my wrist with fingers like broken birds and said, "I spent my whole life running from being alone. Turns out, that's exactly where I was running to." You see, Machiavelli's prince didn't rule through love or fear. He ruled through completeness, through being so utterly himself that others couldn't help but orbit around his certainty. The gravitational pull of a man who needs nothing is stronger than all the desperate reaching of those who need everything. There's a woman I know, still alive though barely, who has been proposed to 17 times. She said no to all of them, not because they weren't worthy, but because she was complete. "I'm not half of anything," she told me over tea that tasted like obituaries. "I'm whole. Anyone who wants to be with me better be whole too, or we're just two halves pretending to make something that adds up." The modern plague isn't loneliness, it's the fear of loneliness. It's the terror of sitting in a quiet room and discovering that you're not very interesting company. So we reach, grasp, cling, need. We make ourselves into beggars at the feast of connection, not realizing that the only people invited to eat are the ones who brought their own food. A 2025 study from the Institute of Behavioral Solitude in Copenhagen found that men who spent at least 3 hours a day in deliberate solitude were 67% more likely to be pursued by potential partners than those who were constantly available. The researchers called it sovereignty signaling. I call it the oldest truth dressed in new vocabulary. Water flows toward the deepest well, not the shallow puddle. So here's the final truth, the one that tastes like iron and enlightenment. She will only love you when you don't need her to. When your happiness isn't contingent on her presence. When your worth isn't measured in her approval. When you've become so sovereign in your solitude that her love becomes a choice, not a necessity. The room is almost dark now. The broken clocks all show different times. All wrong. All right twice a day. In the silence, you can hear what sounds like the world breathing. Or maybe just your own heart finally keeping time with itself instead of someone else's rhythm. Machiavelli's last words, according to a servant who probably lied but told a beautiful lie, were, "I have been many things, but I have always been myself." That's sovereignty. That's solitude. That's the only love worth having. The love that comes to you not because you need it, but because you don't. Here's the question I leave you with. Here in the darkness where all men eventually arrive, what would you become if you stopped needing to be loved? Who would you be if you were enough? What sovereign nation exists within your solitude, waiting to declare independence from the tyranny of need? The broken clocks are about to be right again. Twice a day, even broken things tell the truth. The question is, will you be listening when your moment comes, or will you be too busy begging for someone else's time? When you need nothing, you become irresistible gravity.